Hello and welcome back to Yellow Card Vanguard. As you can see, today we have the Link Joker Premium deck profile for you. This is something that I've wanted to make for a while and I've just never found the time, so sorry for the wait, and here it is. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that this channel is sponsored by Strictly Broken TCG. Thank you for them sponsoring the channel. You can head to strictlybrokentcg.ca for a discount on your playset and playset pre-orders by using the code SBTCGYellowcard at checkout. Also again, thank you to all of you watching. We finally hit 2,000 subs on the channel not too long ago, and I wasn't planning for this to be the thank you video, it just so happened to time up nicely. But again, we've hit that milestone. Thank you to everyone for watching the videos, thank you for learning, and thank you for supporting the channel. So without further ado, let's talk about the deck and some of the options it has. So starting off with the zeros, we've got our starter, obviously, and then we go on to our triggers. Now, there's really not much room for flexibility in the trigger lineup here. You've got the 4 heals, as you'd expect, and 4 of each premium collection crit. They're not particularly incredible, it's just that crits are the most effective triggers in this deck beyond draws, and these all have effects, so there's no reason not to play them. The stride crit is way more valuable than the 10k and soul crit, but this can also be useful because the deck does have some soul issues depending on how long the game is going. And then finally, 4 draw PGs. I have seen some lists splashing the old Cosmo Wreath with the grade 1 countercharge PG, and I think that's fine as maybe a 1 or a 2 of in some instances, but given the current meta, I feel like the draw PGs are just way more valuable, it's just easier to have consistency, and there's not really much room at the grade 1 slot for them. Next, moving on to the grade 1s, we've got our 8 critical pieces from the G combos era, which is Dunamis Messiah and Sacrifice Messiah. So Dunamis is your extender and Sacrifice is your resource enabler, and they both do something very important, which is that they lock themselves, which is going to be relevant for the combos later on. Because they're both G unit pieces, they only have 7k power and 5k shield, so it's kind of worrying to have to play 8 copies of these, but you need to see them for your combo, and so we need to have as much consistency as possible there. And then also in the grade 1s, we've got 3 Tempest Sphere. This is pretty much a bonus, it's nice to have. I find it's not critically important a lot of the time, so this is one of the flex slots that we'll be talking about later on, but for now it's there just because it can sometimes help you high roll into a victory or really get you there if you need to go early aggressive. And then the other grade 1 is Lady Battle of the White Dwarf. She's our consistency piece, she's an 8k beat stick, it's a new grade 1 so it's got 10k shield which is really valuable. And the main thing is that she finds grade 3s, and she doesn't just find Messiahs, she can find any grade 3, and that's going to be really relevant later on. At the moment I'm only playing 3 because of space reasons, and I think if you could easily find 4, you would definitely play 4, but at the moment we've got other stuff that we need to play, and it is again, one of the potential quote-unquote flex slots. You might have 4, or you could potentially have 0 depending on some of the lists, but for now we've got the 3, and I think it's fine there. Then moving on to the grade 2s, we have a very thin grade 2 lineup. As you can see, there's only 7 of them, which is the 4 Gastro and 3 Lady Fencer. Now, you might look at 7 grade 2s and be very concerned about riding, but the mathematics actually is that with a regular mulligan, depending on how deep you mulligan, you're anywhere between 55% to 70% to hit one of these grade 2s. And then you've got your draw for starter, drive checks, and so on and so forth. So it's really not that problematic. Obviously, you might have to G-assist once or twice more than an average deck for grade 2, but the thing is, grade 2 doesn't really provide anything much to the deck because we have Volco, and which I'll explain in a bit. But the fact is, any grade 2 you play is either going to be an enabler for the combo, i.e. the Volco, like Gastro is, or it's going to be a backup when you don't have Volco, like with Lady Fencer is. And so I'll explain sort of the ratios you can play with and some of the other options in a bit. And then rounding out the main deck's top end, we have 4 Volco, as you would expect. He's the haymaker of the deck, he's your main beat stick, he does everything you need, he locks himself, gives you power, it's just really, really valuable to have. The only downside into the premium build is that you have a few less ways of cheating Volco onto the board. So you've only got Gastro and Alter Ego Messiah, which we also play at 4 of here. And you don't have Manipulator of the Emptiness, or anything like that. You don't have clear frames to be able to unlock them during the main phase. You're very much reliant on either sticking him onto the board early with Alter Ego or Gastro's effect, or finding a way to just get him out onto the board later on by finding a Gastro later on. So it's kind of risky in that it's not as easy to put down to the board, but it's still probably one of the best rear guards Link Joker has access to, and it just fulfills everything you need. Again, with Alter Ego Messiah, you need to play 4 of him because he's your Force Vanguard, he uses that gift to the 13k base, it also +2 to the board, especially if you've been rushed early and you've got cards to call back, and it's one of the few ways we have of getting Vulcan to the table. And then finally rounding out the grade 3s is what I believe actually to be the most important card in the deck, which is a Freeze Ray Dragon. Now, I honestly believe that Freeze Ray Dragon is probably the only reason that Link Joker can even be played in Premium today. If you look at what's tier 1, like Shadow Paladin, Dark Irregulars, Murakumo, Pale Moon, all of these decks really struggle to deal with the defensive ability that Freeze Ray brings, in that it can lock off potentially 2 columns during your opponent's battle phase, which gives you 2 less attacks to defend against, which means that you can actually survive late into the game to hit your win cons. I can see that some decks might not play this, or might only play 2 or 3. The reason I'm playing 4 is just because in the local environment where I play in, it's so important to hit the Freeze Ray Dragon. I want to play 4 just so I can always guaranteed have it no matter what. So before we move on to the G-Zone, I'd now like to explain some of the other options that the deck has. And we'll go in reverse order, starting at the grade 3. So there's 2 extra cards you can play at the grade 3 that I think are worth considering. The first one being Alter Ego Neo, back from the G era. Now this provides 2 main benefits. The first one is that with his Stride skill, you can cheat Vulcan onto the board. So when you Stride, you can call a card from your hand to rearguard and then lock a card. Now if you just place the Vulcan from his Stride skill without locking it, the Vulcan will try to retire itself because of its own on-place. But if you lock the Vulcan before his ability finishes resolving, or as his ability finishes resolving, then the Vulcan will no longer be able to retire itself, and you'll end up with a locked Vulcan on the board, which isn't great, but it's fine because you have Strides that can unlock. And obviously the end of turn Soul Blast 1 draw 2 is also really good for surviving the game. It's not as good defensively as Freeze Ray Dragons locking a rearguard column, but drawing some extra cards can be useful, especially as well as digging for combo pieces. The other grade 3 we can run is the new Deleter, which is Idolga. So you don't care about his rearguard effect, you're only playing him in this deck for his Vanguard effect, which is on place, counterblast 1, discard 1 and delete your opponent's Vanguard. And this doesn't exactly synergize with the rest of the deck, but what it is good for is applying a really strong aggro combo turn when you need to. So you can ride him, on place, delete your opponent's Vanguard, and then go into your Stride combos, which is really effective against decks that can have like a really strong defensive Vanguard, like say Angel Feather, or maybe Dark Irregulars, or what have you. So being able to have that extra ceiling on the top end can sometimes be useful. So I'll explain this and some of its lines of play afterwards as well when we talk about combos. Then in the grade 2 lineup, obviously we're only playing 7 grade 2s at the moment. You can definitely add up more by trimming spaces elsewhere, like say the grade 3s or the grade 1s. But generally, if you want to play more than that, there's not really that many better options. The first one we're going to talk about is actually the old Lady Fencer from back in G era. So she's got the same name, so you can't play both of these in the same deck. You only play up to 4 total of both. And basically the thing about this Lady Fencer is that she's not GB restricted and she doesn't cost Counterblast, and she's a 15k body, which is fine. But the thing about this Lady Fencer is that she hits 16, which is, so that 1 extra 1000 power usually isn't relevant, but depending on how you boost and how you assign power triggers from Sacrifice or Dunamis, then sometimes it might make a difference. But the main reason to play her, despite her costing GB and Counterblast 1, is for the Soul Charge. As I've mentioned, this deck does actually use quite a lot of Soul, especially if you're going for like really deep combos. So sometimes you will have Soul problems, and so Lady Fencer can help fix that or mitigate that if you need it. And then the other grade 2 option is Mega Messiah. Now this is a very unusual option, I'm going to say, mainly because all of its effects are GB locked, and it costs Counterblast, and the deck doesn't use that much Counterblast to begin with, but it uses enough to worry about. And the only reason to play Mega is, again, he's just another way of hitting Vulcan onto the board, because you can look at top 3, find a Vulcan, put onto the board, and then go from there. The only downside is that he provides no other benefit early game unless you have Tempest Sphere, and generally you're only playing this just to ride it and as a really backup in case you can't find your Vulcans, which is already a bad situation. So again, before I talk about the G units, I just want to explain the concept of Counterblast in the deck. So as you can see, we've only got 2 cards in the deck that cost Counterblast. We've got Gastra, and we've got the Tempest Sphere. Now, these don't use that much Counterblast massively on their own. You're only going to be using Gastra once or twice to put Vulcans onto the board, and then Tempest Sphere again only once or twice just to get that early GB in case you want to be rushing with Dunamis or the Vulcan. Now, despite that, you'll find that the deck actually doesn't have that much Counterblast to play with, mainly because when you're, especially if you're going first, and you ride like a 7k Vanguard, they'll hit you for 7k, give you that damage you need, but then when you ride the 10k, it's very likely that they'll be able to swing under or just pass altogether because they're afraid of you popping off with a combo or whatever. So it's very rare that you'll be able to use both Gastra and Tempest Sphere within the early game before striding, and so determining what to use your Counter Blast on is really relevant. So for example, if you know they have an Alter Ego in hand, and you're about to ride it, then you don't need to use the Counter Blast on Gastra, because you can use Alter Ego to get out the Volco, and then you can spend that Counter Blast on the Tempest Sphere instead, to then enable things like Sacrifice and Dunamis, which is what's really important for your early game aggro. At the same time, if you know you're going to be riding Freeze Ray instead, and you don't have a way of getting the Volco onto the board, then you can afford to give up the Tempest Sphere and go into the Gastra, and use Gastra to put Volco down, because you know that with the defensive power of Freeze Ray, you're going to get the opportunity to stride multiple times. So, now let's talk about the G-Zone. And we'll start with the G-Guards, because there's not much room for flexibility there, so we can just get through them very quickly. We've got a total of 5 G-Guards, being 2 Cosmo Wreath, 1 Destiny Guardian, 1 Lady Healer, and 1 Lacus Karina. And these 3 are probably the most important ones because they're disruptive. You can lock your opponent's back row, which is really relevant for combo decks such as No Life King and Murakumo. And then these 2 are just sort of extra shield value. Both of them are not easy to get to. You can get there, but it's not reliable enough. So for example, for Lady Healer, unless you've had something that locked their back row, like a Basaltis or the Glue Ball Stride, then you'll need to use Cosmo Wreath first before her plus 5k turns on. Likewise with Destiny Guardian, you really want to be unlocking your own units, not your opponent's units. Therefore, he's best when coming off of a Lacus Karina and you actually have back row to unlock again. Now, a lot of the strides in the Link Joker deck are very toolboxy. You see that we have a lot of 2-ofs, a lot of pairs. So going through them, we've got the Glue Ball Avalanche pair, a pair of Integral Messiah, a pair of Transels, a pair of Basaltis, and a pair of Amnesty, and then to round off the 16 is the 1 Vario End. I'll talk about Vario End last because he's a unquote tech option, and there's a few things you can replace him with, and likewise the Amnesty I'll leave second to last. So these are all the important ones, and I'll go through each one of them in turn. So let's start off with the Integral Messiah. So Integral is both your main combo piece and also your win con. His first effect, which is that when he's placed on V, both players hand reset to 5 cards. Now, you need to have 3 face-up Messiah units in your G-Zone to do that, but with the advent of Tempest Sphere and Freeze Ray giving you some defensive power, that's actually fairly easy to get to. And the second effect, which is when he attacks, Counterblast 1, unlock all your units. If you unlock 3, Soul Charge 1, draw a card, and he gives himself 10,000 power. All of those effects and results are good. You want the Soul Charge so you can afford to use Dunamis repeatedly and get the combo off. You want to draw a card because then you can plus and guard and survive the opponent's turns. And then you want to give him plus 10,000 power, that way his column is actually threatening. Because you have Volcos, which should hopefully be on Force 2 columns, which are already 30k on their own. And then your Vanguard is only 28, so the additional 10 from itself and the Volcos makes him 48 or even bigger depending on your triggers and boosters. And that can then give you enough pressure on your Vanguard that your opponent's forced to guard the Vanguard as well as the Volco columns, which then gives you more pressure overall. Next is the Basaltis. Basaltis fulfills a very similar role to Integral in that he unlocks multiple units and he draws a card. The difference with Basaltis is that Basaltis can also lock your opponent's units, meaning that if you've been able to go into a Tempest Sphere, or if this is your second stride, then you can lock down your opponent's board, and that keeps you alive going to the next few turns. It's basically a way of getting to Integral's 3 face-up Messiah units without having to waste all of your Integrals and so on and so forth. It's a very good bridging stride, and while it's not as effective at the combo as Integral is because it only unlocks 1 or 2 during the first strides, later on you can get a full board reset and then combo off again from there. Then we've got Glue Ball Avalanche. In Glue Ball Avalanche, his first effect, the G-Zone effect, is kind of pretty much unused. The main thing you're going to be using him for is just locking your opponent's front row. Because he's a non-counter blast cost, he's only cost Soul Blast and flipping a G unit, and then he locks 2 of your opponent's units. And that's exactly what you need, because again, it's defensive power, it lets you survive a bit later into the game so you can hit the Integral Stride, and most importantly, if you don't Tempest Sphere, you can start off with a Glue Ball, Soul Blast on to flip the Amnesty or one of your spare Integrals, and then that gives you 1 out of the 2, because all the other Messiah units are Persona flips. So you go Glue Ball, flip something into a Basaltis, flip another one, and then that becomes the 3 face-up you need for the hand reset. The power boost is nice as well, but it's not mega relevant, and that's pretty much all you need to know. It's just a case of, he just buys you that extra turn, he's just an extra locking piece that doesn't cost Counterblast. And then finally, again, is an extra locking piece, which is Transels. Transels is a little bit the timing of Transil is not 100% great, because he's on place, and it's GB2, meaning that you either have to Tempest Sphere into the first stride Transels, or you have to have gone into a Glue Ball or an Integral first before Transels really does anything. But at the same time, Transels does something that the other two can't do, which is a full field lock. And you might say that, oh, but he locks your field as well, that's not very good. The difference is that you don't care about rushing your opponent down and getting a bunch of attacks off, you care about surviving to the Integral turn. So losing 2 rearguards attacks on yourself is not the end of the world, compared to stopping your opponent from getting 2 extra rearguards attacks on you. And at the same time, there's also a bit of an extra interaction with the Alter Ego Neo, which I'll explain in a little bit. And obviously, like I mentioned, we have 2 Amnesties. These are basically always just going to be flip fodder for things like the Integral or the Global Avalanche or your Tempest Spheres. You will go into this once every now and again, mainly because he gives himself a crit. The power gain is not really relevant, it's just having the crit on the Vanguard, which if you think your opponent doesn't have PGs or is going to struggle to guard all the attacks, you can just force that lethal out of nowhere sometimes. But like I said, generally it's always going to be flip fodder for your other pieces. And then Vario End is removes all your opponent's gifts. This can be really good against stuff such as Harry Pale Moon, or something that re-rides a lot like Ezel and gains a lot of Axel markers, or even DI that can get a lot of protect markers and just like tank up. It doesn't win you the game, it just stops your opponent from being in an unlosable position. So I've never really gone into this much, but it's good to have, especially because my local area is full of Harry, so it's just nice to have every now and again. And it's good to know that it's there in case you need it, but like I said, this is the flex slot, so it's not super important. And now let's take a look at what we can fill those flex slots with. So there's a lot of different strides that Link Joker has access to, but only a few of them are really valuable, so I'm only going to cover 3 or 4 here. So the first one is also you can always play more copies of Integral. Integral is very rarely ever a bad card. The only downside is that to hit his 3 unlock requirement, it needs you to have at least 1 Volco or a Fencer, and then at least 1 extra piece of back row like Sacrifice or Dunamis, and then something else. So say Volco, Fencer, Dunamis, or Volco, Double Dunamis, or Volco, Sacrifice Dunamis, or whatever. And if you're bricking, kind of, or you need to guard aggressively, then you can sometimes not have the hand pieces needed. But at the same time, generally, like unless you're in a really bad position, it should be always fine to go into Integral. The other option is also just another pair of Basaltis. So Basaltis has always been a really strong combo piece because it both locks your opponent's stuff and unlocks your stuff, and it doesn't have the requirement of Integral to get its pieces. You just need to unlock at least 1 of your own, which you should always have if you're striding into this. If you have nothing of your own to unlock, then I would say the game's already lost, so that's not really worth worrying about. And then to replace the Vario End singletons, there's the classic 2 regular offenders, being the Progenitor Dragon, which is Origorum, and then the Xeros Dragon, which is Stark. I find that Origorum is a lot more valuable than the Stark, mainly because depending on what your grade 3 lineup is going to be, sometimes not having the ultimate stride is going to be quite difficult to do. And as well as that, having 2 Counterblast free is actually very difficult to do, because all of your strides, as you've seen until now, cost Counterblast, barring Global Avalanche, and then you want to be counterblasting for Gastroar and Tempest Sphere as well. And it's very likely you won't actually have that much counterblast to spend during your combo turns. And despite that, Stark is still a very strong win condition. It's 38k minimum if you're striding onto Alter Ego, or 35 if you're striding onto Freeze Ray, and 3 big Vanguard attacks is actually pretty relevant. The only downside to Link Joker is that because you have Volcos that lock themselves and your rearguards don't retain power bonuses, you will sometimes, getting the triggers from the start, usually have to go to him because they'll be wasted on the rearguards. Origorum, on the other hand, is actually very valuable because he provides you free striding if you go into him the first time. The only thing is that his actual effect is not that great. It's basically a soft delete, but because the delete skill is tied to the stride rather than to the Vanguard, the grade 3 that is, you can't go into like any of these combo extending strides that give you multiple Volco attacks. So when you go into the Origorum, you have no way of unlocking your units beyond Dunamis during the stride turn, and so you need to already be high rolling kind of a lot for Origorum to really pay off. He's still worth it, it's just a case of this is sometimes going to be bad and this is sometimes going to be amazing, which is what the decision. And then the last tech slot that I am a big fan of is the 1 Excelix. So as you saw, we're playing 2 copies of Amnesty, which are generally going to be flip fodder for your various effects, like Tempest Sphere or Integral or what have you. And Excelix's condition of needing an Amnesty face up can then be fulfilled very easily. And the reason Excelix is actually better a stride into than Amnesty is because you don't really need the power to your Vanguard most of the time. So Integral gives himself plus 10k, which is great, that makes nice round numbers, but Amnesty gives himself plus 3k for each unlock, and that can sometimes be very difficult in making big columns. Compared to Excelix, which gives itself no power, but it gives power to the unlocked units. So assuming you have an ideal scenario of a column of Volco, boosted by Dunamis, when this attacks the first time, and you boost, it's going to be 37. Then Volco will lock itself to plus 10k to Vanguard, and then Dunamis will lock itself to unlock the Volco. And you can either give 4k to the Volco itself, or the other 4k to the Vanguard again. That's not super important. Either way, the Volco is going to attack again for 30 or 34, lock himself, plus another 10 to the Vanguard on the Excelix. So Excelix is now a 43k base. And then when Excelix attacks, he'll unlock this entire column. You have another thing to unlock here, he'll gain the crit, which is great. But even if not, this column itself now starts off at 43, which is a magic number against Force decks, and just a generally big number altogether. And it's very reminiscent of the decks that can hit in standard with the plus 10k from the Alter Egos effect. But having the 43 here is actually a really relevant power boost, and even though you're never going to retire your opponent's locked units because you're not locking any of their units on your own, it's just a nice to have for when you need it, especially as like a sort of mid-game breaching stride. If you flip the Amnesty with the Temper Sphere, Excelix can apply a lot of pressure, give you a lot of numbers if you don't need to like worry about surviving. So that's the extra options we have for the G-Zone. And now let's look a little bit about how some of these options can interact and how the deck sort of plays. So the first option we'll be looking at is the Alter Ego Neo, and why he's even worth considering. So like I said, you can use him to cheat out the Volco, which is very relevant when you stride. And one of the best strides you can actually use off of this is actually the Transels, provided you're on GB2. So what you'll do is, you'll have Alter Ego Neo on this Vanguard. When you stride into Transels, the stride skill will go off, call the Volco, lock the Volco from the Alter Ego Neo so Volco doesn't kill itself, and then Transels on play will lock all of your opponent's units, and then unlock your Volco so that you can attack with it, and then have a Dunamis behind it if you so have that. So this actually makes the Transels play not like super damp. You actually have attacks you can do, you can actually apply some pressure, and it's not that awful. And then the other option we want to talk about is the Idolga. Like I said, Idolga doesn't care about anything else, you just place him, and then you delete your opponent's Vanguard. And when you do that, you can then very easily stride into Integral. Both of Integral's effects don't care about having Messiah on your heart, so you can place him over Idolga, get the hand reset, so your opponent has 5 cards in hand to guard a 0 power Vanguard, and then you have your unlock effects with your Volcos and your Dunamis combo from there and thereforth, with the Integrals reset to get at least 5 to 6 attacks against their 0 power Vanguard with 5 cards in hand. Finally, if you're looking to find out what to cut to add the various tech pieces or you want to adjust the list, even though I said that Freeze Ray is one of the most important cards in the deck, if your meta doesn't actually recall for it, then you can replace it with a more late game piece like Idolga or Alter Ego Neo, just to have that sort of ceiling and the combo potential to actually win the game rather than just waiting for the Integral hand reset. If you want to play more of the grade 2 lineup, then pretty much these grade 2s can't really be cut. You can add more if you so wish, or you can adjust this for the old fence like I mentioned. And then the only real spots you have in terms of flex space overall are your non-combo grade 1s, being the White Dwarf and the Temper Sphere. So you can sort of adjust these back and forth between any of each other however you wish, as in these 10 cards. It gives you a little bit of flex room to play with, but the reason I have this configuration sleeved right now is pretty much entirely due to my local meta, i.e. worrying about Pale Moon and Murakumo and Dark Irregulars, and then the White Dwarf kind of just fetches you that freeze ray that you need. And then Temper Sphere, again, is not strictly necessary, it was just nice to fill in the gaps. You could definitely get away without these and just play heavier grade 3 lineup, heavier grade 2 lineup, more of grade 1s or whatever, and you still have plenty of cards left over to play around with. So the deck's actually quite flexible in what it does. The only thing that's not flexible with is the combo and the win con. You're still, at the end of the day, relying on Volco to win you the game. You're still, at the end of the day, relying on the Integral hand reset to get you there. And you're kind of just hoping that these extra combo you get from Sacrifice and Dunamis are enough. And unfortunately, usually they aren't. So despite this video, I still think the deck is sort of tier 2, tier 3 at best. But it's a lot of fun to play. And if it goes off, then it's a lot of mental work you have to do to go, okay, how do I survive this? Which resource do I burn now? Which stride do I go into? And sort of like planning your attack while also prepping your defense is something that I really enjoy thinking about, and so that's why I still have it to this day. And that's going to be it for today. Hopefully, this has lived up to the expectations that people are hoping for. I've tried to go a little bit more in-depth than I usually do for these sorts of things, and from there, I hope you can experiment yourself, try it out yourself, test yourself, see what works for you, see what doesn't, and go from there. But that's going to be it for today, for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Zistral with Yellow Card Vanguard, and again, sponsored by Strictly Broken TCG. Use the code SBTCGYellowCard at checkout for a discount. And from that point on, just give the video a like if you've liked it, subscribe to the channel if you want to keep up with what we're doing, check out all the links down below in the description, and hopefully we'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye bye.